keynote of the event, which is with Rachel Wolfson and Julian Wheatland. As I mentioned before, Rachel is a current journalist at Cointelegraph. It's one of the most prestigious cryptocurrency blockchain news sources out there. She used to work at Forbes, and she actively writes about enterprise blockchain. And Julian Wheatland is he's the CEO for a little bit, primarily the COO of Cambridge Analytica. And for those who do not know what Cambridge Analytica is, I'm assuming you guys will explain it all, but I'll give a little bit of a rundown. There was a big scandal back about 2017, 2016 during the election with Facebook, where they were misusing a lot of personal data of individuals who filled out a specific survey. So who here has, raise your hand if you've taken one of those quizzes of what kind of bread are you? Or what's your Harry Potter? It wasn't that, but when we take those quizzes, we don't really know what we're giving up. And, we kind of just assume that we're just trying to figure out what kind of bread we are. Turns out you're sourdough, and now they have all your personal information, your friends' personal informations, and a lot of other things that could very, very easily be used against you. So Julian he's done a great job. He was actually, he was on The Great Hack. It's a documentary on Netflix that highlighted the whole scandal, and he's been incredibly great and open about the different practices that they did and what went wrong and why things went wrong and what they could do and what you can do to protect yourselves in the future. So without further ado, Rachel Wolfson and Julian Wheatland. Put your hands together.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Cameron. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. So thanks for coming out today to beautiful Santa Barbara. I'm Rachel Wolfson, and this is Julian Wheatland.
Hi.
And so let's just get our fireside chat started. So Julian, I think we should first talk about your background. So can you just tell us what you were doing before Cambridge Analytica and how you got involved with the company and what your current role is now?
Well, I'm an engineer by training, but then I moved from engineering much more into the business side of technology companies. And I first came across a company called SCL, which stood for Strategic Communications Laboratories, back in 2005, when I was managing a technology investment fund. And we invested some money in this company. And I joined the board of the company as a representative of the investor. And this company was, it was a strategic communications business, and its real aim was to help governments project influence overseas to foreign populations. And so the governments that it primarily worked for were the UK government, the US government, probably Five Eyes and NATO. And so, for example, if you were the State Department and you wanted to influence young males in a Pakistan border village to steer them away from extremism, then that was the work that SCL did, and they were probably the go-to shop for that for a while. And so this seemed like a great thing to invest in, because Homeland Security was becoming really relevant at the time. And it just seemed like such a better idea to communicate with people in foreign countries rather than lob missiles at them. So I liked the business. And the business did very well. And it grew to a significant size. And then one of the founders, a chap called Alexander Nix, left and set up a new business using some of the techniques which had been developed, and his new business was focused on elections markets. So that became SCL Elections, and that was a separate business for a long time. And then he formed a joint venture in the US with some American investors, and that business was Cambridge Analytica. And the aim of Cambridge Analytica was to take some of the ideas about understanding people and therefore understanding how to communicate with them and move that into the world of big data. And so amassing large quantities of data, analysing that, trying to understand what motivates people and what drives people, and therefore communicate with them more effectively. And Cambridge Analytica grew very rapidly. So the first election it was involved with was the 2014 midterms. And towards the end of 14, beginning of 15, Alexander rang me up and he said, this is growing so quickly, I need some help in managing it. And so I joined initially as I think about half of my time at the beginning of 2015, just to help him manage the finances. And by the middle of that year, I was probably spending about 150% of my time on the business, and it was going great guns. We were working on the Ted Cruz campaign, and we worked on that campaign up until he dropped out, and then we flipped to the Donald Trump for President campaign in June of 2016. And so that's how I got involved.
Yeah, interesting. So you have an engineering background, and so then you joined the company with Alexander Nix, who you knew. And as former CEO, what exactly was your role there?
So I was COO and CFO, so Chief Operating Officer and Chief Finance Officer for most of the time that I was there. And that was really managing and growing the organization. So we grew from 12 people to 120 people. And we had offices in London, New York, Washington, D.C. And we had businesses that were in elections, in commercial services to big brand companies, also in government services, so to do work for governments to help them with their own communication programs. And so my job was to, number one, make sure that the finances added up, but number two was also to make sure that we had the right people in the right place and the right operational infrastructure, the right policies, procedures, etc. I took over as chief executive of the company in about March or April 2017. And that was at a time when the chief executive, who was always a stellar marketer, had oversold the services of the company and got caught on an undercover video offering services which were immoral, inappropriate, probably illegal, for an election in Sri Lanka. And at that point, the board of the company asked him to step down, and I took over. But by that time, that came on the back of what had been ever-growing media interest in the company, some would say controversy. And that video of Alexander was really the straw that broke the camel's back. So at that point, there was not really much future for the company because we were losing both customers and suppliers. And my main activity as chief executive was actually to wind down operations, let everybody go and close the company.
Okay, and that was before the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, I guess?
It was after the Cambridge Analytica
okay.
Facebook scandal. The Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal dated back to 2015.
Okay.
And in fact, that Facebook data had been licensed by the company in 2014.
Okay. Can you explain what happened during that scandal?
Yeah, sure. What happened was in 2014, a chap called Chris Wiley, who you may have seen on the news. He's the chap with the pink hair. He got together with Alexander Nix and introduced him to a professor at Cambridge University in the UK. And this professor had an arrangement with Facebook whereby he could access people's data on Facebook, I think primarily for academic purposes. And they struck a deal so that he set up a quiz on Facebook. It was called This Is Your Digital Life. And they harvested a large quantity of people's data, everybody who filled in the survey, but perhaps more controversially, actually take the perhaps out, more controversially, it harvested all of their friends' data as well. And so they amassed a large quantity of data around what people liked, what they didn't like, etc. And then he collected that data and he licensed some of it to Cambridge Analytica to be used in order to try and develop profiles of people for the purposes of understanding how to more effectively target them with ads. Just to finish that story, so that happened in 2014. It came out in the press in 2015, and that's when Facebook contacted Cambridge Analytica and asked us to delete that data, which I'm going to say for the record we did. But in the following year, we then worked for the Trump campaign, and the work that we'd done on the Trump campaign also attracted a lot of media attention. And then this story of Facebook data came back, and it was reported in the press that we hadn't deleted it. And that span out of control pretty quickly. And Facebook were back in contact with us. Regulators on both sides of the Atlantic were challenging us and serving us with notices not to delete any data. Facebook were coming in to conduct an audit of our systems, but then they got stopped by the UK regulator, who was concerned that we and Facebook were colluding. And you can't imagine how quickly it span out of control and how unprepared or inadequately prepared we were for that. And so the video with Alexander came on the back of that, and that's why I describe it as the straw that broke the camel's back.
Right, and you've mentioned in a previous interview that Cambridge Analytica spent a lot of time on ensuring that regulations were met, but that the biggest mistakes made were ethical ones. Can you kind of explain that further?
Yeah, sure. I don't know whether any of you were in the two presentations ago, or three presentations ago, where people were talking about, you know, the value of regulation. We spent, as most companies spend, a lot of time, a lot of money on lawyers, making sure that what we were doing what was compatible with regulations on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think, honestly, for the most part, we were successful there. Although I should caveat that by saying there are still regulators trying to prove otherwise, you know, I can't be certain that we didn't make a mistake, but I think that we achieved that. But so when I step back and look at it, I see a situation where we managed to be regulatory compliant, but still scandalous, and still lose public confidence, and still come out as bad actors in the whole thing. And so, as I reflect on it, what I realised that we never had within the company were processes alongside, or procedures alongside our operations that not just confirmed the legal compliance of what we were doing, but also there was never any ethical question or any ethical check on what we were doing. And it would be easy, I think, to say, well, why do you need a process? Why do you need a procedure? I mean, if it was unethical, why didn't someone shout out? And the truth of the matter is that within a business, within a corporation, within a rapidly going corporation, it's not reasonable to expect people to spot questionable ethical activities if you don't give them any tools for doing so. I mean, the whole question of ethics, in particular in this space, there is a high degree of subjectivity to it. And if you don't provide some sort of framework for employees to be able to assess innovation, new sources of data, new ways of analysing it or manipulating it, if you don't provide any framework or benchmark to assess that against, then it's not reasonable to expect people to flag up something which may or may not become a problem, particularly in an environment where innovation is the order of the day, and half of the company was spent on trying to come up with new ways of analysing data and new ways of getting insight. And so as I reflect back on it, and I've had plenty of time to reflect on it, it seems to me that this whole question of ethical compliance is really underserved in terms of the way that we think about businesses, manage technology. And we should put a lot more effort into coming up with a structure or structures that allow companies to set out their stall, say very clearly and publicly what their ethical position is, and then set up processes inside the company in order to adhere to that ethical position. And I would probably even take that a stage further, and I would say, and then invite other people to come in and audit those processes in order to provide reassurance to the outside world that those processes are being adhered to. Now, what you may or may not have noticed that I didn't say was that the outside world should tell the company what it's doing, what it should do. And the reason I didn't say that is that there is a role for a regulatory framework, and that should say what companies can and can't do, but it's only a framework. And the reason it's only a framework is because regulators will always be late to the party. They'll always be regulating something that happened 2 years ago and backward looking. There is an exception to that, which is overburdensome regulation, which will stifle innovation. And I'm not an advocate of that, because then we won't have technology advances. So if regulation doesn't stifle innovation, it's going to be out of date. And so that's why I look to the companies themselves that are conducting the innovation, that are coming up with the new ideas, to apply their ethics, their ethical position to their own activities in a way that regulators can't. And what that also does is it provides the environment for there to be competition. Because I also think that there are grey areas here. For example, I let Google know everything about me. I honestly, I'm not that interesting, I don't care, and I prefer to see ads that are relevant to me in a simplistic way, yeah? And I kind of like it when Google comes up with a new widget that tells me something that I didn't even know I knew I wanted to know. But I also understand that not everybody feels the same. And so we ought to be able to see transparently what companies are doing with our data, how they're doing it, what their ethical standpoint is, and then be able to choose, well, do I want to pay more? For example, do I want to buy an Apple product and be reliant on Tim Cook's assurance that he will not touch my data? Or do I want to use other products that are financed by targeted advertising and provide free services, not just to me, but to billions of people around the world that rely on them? I don't think there's a single right answer, but I think there should be competition, there should be choice, there should be transparency, and we need to have reassurance that what's going on inside a company is what they say. And so there needs to be some sort of framework for that.
Right, yeah, well, you make great points, and I think you kind of already answered this question, but I'll ask you anyways. So do you think what Cambridge Analytica did was considered illegal, or is it more just about ethics?
So there are nuances in that, and it's actually the original data from Facebook that Cambridge Analytica licensed. It's actually not clear to me whether or not that Cambridge academic was allowed to license it to us or not. There's been back and forth between him and Facebook. At one point he took a legal action against them. He sued them because they said they didn't know about it. He quickly realized that suing Facebook is a loser's game, whatever the truth, and so that fell away. I can tell you that other than a minor administrative thing which happened after I had put the company into bankruptcy, Cambridge Analytica hasn't been found guilty of having done anything illegal. And I'm certainly not aware of anything that went on that was illegal. So I'm going to say, on balance, I think that it didn't do anything illegal. But we may have done some things that were ethically questionable.
Right, so let's talk a little bit about the Trump campaign. Do you think Cambridge Analytica made a difference there? And if so, how?
So I'd be a lousy businessman if I said no to that, wouldn't I? We sold the Trump campaign data analytics and digital marketing services, and so the head of analytics in the San Antonio headquarters was our guy, and the head of digital marketing in the same place was our girl, and. You know, we did a lot of analytics. We didn't use the psychographic targeting that we had developed, mostly because we weren't in that campaign long enough. We were only there for 3 months from the convention through to election day. So there were no psychographics used, but there were a lot of analytics used. And there were a lot of analytics used in combination with polling. And I think that this is where we did make a difference. The trick to any type of polling, but in particular election polling, is polling the people who are going to vote, which is subtly different from polling the people who say they are going to vote. So we conducted a huge amount of polling, but we also combined it with the analytics where we could see what different demographics were turning out to vote and which ones weren't. And so in the run-up to the election, probably in the last 2 weeks before the election, we could see that in certain states, certain demographics were increasing their turnout and certain demographics were decreasing their turnout. And what we could interpret from that was that even though Hillary was ahead of the Trump campaign in most of those states at that time, the direction of travel, the trajectory, was that Trump was increasing and she was decreasing, and at that rate, it looked like there could be an upset in the vote. So those are the states that we directed the campaign to go out and canvass in, and now famously the states which tipped, and Hillary's been criticised for not visiting, perhaps unfairly, but nevertheless, we added an insight there that enabled us to both target digital ads, but also target the campaign to those states, which are the states that tipped the balance. Now, I will put a caveat on that. I believe we made a difference, but the difference we made was tiny compared to the one that Jim Comey made. Because Jim Comey reopened the email investigation about 10 days before the election. And it was the first time in the entire election campaign that there was a negative story about Hillary that wasn't counterbalanced or even outweighed by a negative story about Trump. Because all the negative stories about Trump were already out then. And so it stole the news agenda. And it was actually that was driving the shift in turnout and the shift in those particular states shortly before the election.
Okay. And what about Cambridge Analytica's role in Brexit?
We didn't work on Brexit. But I'll tell you the story. And I'll try and shed some light on the confusion. And we are responsible for a large part of the confusion. When Brexit was announced, the Electoral Commission in the UK had the job of selecting an official Leave campaign and an official Remain campaign. And so two organisations were competing to be the official Leave campaign, and the attraction for them of being designated was they got more money to spend on the vote. So one of them approached us and asked if we would work for them, and we put in a proposal to work for them. And they liked the proposal, and they said, "Great, we're going to work with you. And by the way, in 2 days' time, we're having our launch event. Will you come and appear on the panel alongside us?" And so Brittany Kaiser, who worked for us, appeared on their panel, and sat there and said, yes, we're working for Leave.eu, which was the name of the campaign. And then the story ran on, and we kept saying, yes, we're working for Leave.eu. But what never happened, unfortunately, was that the contract that I sent to them never got signed. The money they were supposed to pay never got paid, And so, in fact, if you've ever worked in a consulting type role, you'll know the danger of someone giving you a verbal contract and the risk of doing too much work ahead of getting the paperwork in place and getting paid. So, in fact, we told the press, yes, we're working for them. They told the press that we're working for them, and it went on. And at some point, it became apparent we were not working for them. I did consider at the time taking legal action against them to stop them from saying they were working with us, but I decided it was too much hassle and not worth the bother. In hindsight, I probably would have taken a different decision. So then, run on until the election day. Election day comes along, or the voting day comes along, and then unexpectedly, the country votes to leave the EU. And this was a shocking result. And because we told everybody we were working on the Brexit side, everybody who wanted to find a reason other than it being the voters' choice, the people's choice, turned on Cambridge Analytica and assumed that we had been doing some clever psychographic thing to get people to vote in a way that they wouldn't normally have done, and that we had changed the course of the election. Here's the mistake we made. We didn't deny it. We thought this was a great, well, Alexander thought this was a great way of getting credit for something that was really fantastic, even though we hadn't done it. So if anybody's seen the film The Great Hack, and Alexander is filmed in The Great Hack saying, "I'm sorry, we don't talk about that." And the reason we don't talk about that is because if we talked about it, we would have had to say we didn't do it. And he didn't want to say we didn't do it. So we let people believe we had done it, and boy, did that come back to bite us.
Wow. Okay, good to know. So let's kind of change the topic a little bit. You also mentioned in another interview that you think every company today is a data company. Can you explain what you mean by that and proper data management solutions to enforce there if every company is really a data company?
Yeah, sure. When we talk about data like this and big data, we think of big social networks like Facebook. We think of data analytics companies and advertising companies like Cambridge Analytica. But in reality, big data is called big data because so much of it is being amassed on us all over the place. My coffee shop is a data company. I can tell you that the one organization that knows when I've got a hangover is Starbucks, because they know that I go in and order a particularly unhealthy breakfast on the mornings that I have a hangover, and I do it through my app, and that's data that they're amassing. And so, if my coffee shop is a data company, if my hairdresser is a data company, then all of these organizations need to think about how they manage and use that data, and what ethical position they are taking, and how they communicate that. It's not just for the Silicon Valley tech companies, it's actually for pretty much any organization. Certain industries are regulated, like health and finance, as it should be, but beyond that, it's the Wild West out there. And so, so I believe that what I was saying before about setting up ethical procedures within companies to be very transparent with customers and users as to what data is being collected and how it's being used actually extends to pretty much every organization nowadays.
Right, and I guess since Cambridge Analytica, how have your views on data management and privacy changed? Are you really more focused now on the ethics side of things, or, how has it impacted you with what you think now?
Well, hugely, I would say. Cambridge Analytica for me, if nothing else, was a huge learning experience. But it's also given me a lot of time to reflect. And it's clear to me, looking back, that where we slipped up was in this area of ethical management. We had no process for doing it. But it's also clear to me, and I've spent a lot of years in business that almost no company has these processes to manage the ethical approach that they're taking. So how my views have changed is that previously I thought that you know, regulatory compliance was sufficient. And I should also make a point here that Europe is a very different landscape when it comes to data to the US. California, as of, well, not yet even, but as of January the 1st next year, will have regulations in place around data. But for the most part in the US, there are no regulations about the way data is collected or used. Whereas in Europe, it's very restrictive. But what I would say is that, and how my views have changed, is that it's not enough to rely on the regulator. If we expect the regulators to create a good data world for us, then we'll be sorely disappointed. We have to establish a better communication, more transparency, more openness between the company and the user, and we have to be able to make a choice. And I think that element of choice is probably as much as anything the reason why we can't rely on regulation.
Right. So, random question that I just thought of actually. So, I'm sure there were other companies like Cambridge Analytica doing the same thing, but Cambridge Analytica kind of got caught in this scandal that exploded and then became a documentary and all that. What made it so public? Like, what happened to make it such a huge deal and have you guys exposed, in your opinion?
So how did Cambridge Analytica become Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah.
It was a series of things. The first thing was the Facebook data. And the second thing was the Trump campaign. It's actually an almost parallel story about the Trump campaign as there was in our involvement with the Brexit campaign. Because when we got the contract to provide services to Trump, we didn't think he was going to win. So about 2 months before Election Day, we started this huge media and PR outreach to talk to every journalist that would listen to say, look, we didn't choose the candidate, but what we're doing is brilliant, and it would have been much worse without us. And we pushed that so hard, and then we got to Election Day, and no one thought he was going to win, and he did win, and all the journalists turned around and said, wow, it must have been Cambridge Analytica. And of course, we didn't deny that. So we got credited with that surprising election result, which turned a large section of the media against us. If you put that on top of Brexit, and the same thing had happened with the media, there was a mounting storm. They do say all publicity is good publicity. I'm going to tell you that's not true. You couldn't buy the brand recognition that Cambridge Analytica had after the Trump election. I mean, Alexander, for example, would literally get off a plane in Australia and people would recognize him. And the name was on everybody's lips. And the phone was ringing off the hook from commercial companies and political parties around the world. And so that recognition had become so huge that when the investigation started, that when the FEC and the SEC and the Attorney General and the Mueller inquiry, and then Russian involvement in the election, and well, it must have been Cambridge Analytica, and to turn on the TV every day and see Cambridge Analytica running across the bottom of the CNN screen, stoking up fears about the company or stoking up concerns about the company, which led to fears about democracy. We found ourselves at the nexus, I think, of concern about Brexit, concern about Trump, concern about Facebook, and concern about big data, and we were the perfect whipping boy. Then Alexander Nix's video on top of that was like pouring fuel on the flames, and we just blew up.
Right. I feel like I'm rewatching The Great Hack right now, except in person. Okay, so let's change the subject just a little bit. So since everything has happened, you've taken an interest in blockchain. So why is that?
Well, blockchain, it seems to me, is a... No, so let me back up for a moment. It's clear that there is a lot of room for improvement in the way that corporations handle data, and a lot of concerns about data, and a lot of concerns about data privacy and the way it's shared. And so there's room for, I think, a lot of business model innovation for startups and for existing organizations as to how they handle data, personal data, and how they manage that personal data. And blockchain, it seems to me, is a perfect tool to play a role in that in order to provide security, in order to reassure people of security, security of their data. I don't think that we've seen the ultimate business model yet, but we saw some this morning, people that are working on it and trying to improve the situation. And I think that blockchain technology is going to be a massive player in that.
Right. Another point that we should mention here with blockchain is blockchain ethics and ethics around blockchain, because ethics obviously are very important to you. So do you have any thoughts on that? Just ethics around blockchain?
Yeah, it's the ethical question around blockchain seems to me has got multiple layers. One is the ethics of the counterparty that you're dealing with. And I think a lot of what I've said before applies to whoever that counterparty is, regardless. Then there's the use of the technology, and it seems to me, and maybe I've got it wrong, is that the big advantage or the big attraction of blockchain technology in particular, and also in the cryptosphere, is that we actually give over our reliance on other people, and we give it over to the robustness of the software, and then we rely on the software, and in fact that takes the man out of it. And if that's what we're going to do, then the cost of that, or the risk of that, is that we're going to be susceptible to someone hacking the technology. I've not worked out yet how we can have it both ways. We don't want to be supervised. We want to rely on the software for robustness, and I think that we've just got to suck it up if that's what we're going to do.
Right, and I mean, CipherTrace is here today. They're a great company to talk to in terms of, regulations and keeping people safe. But anyways, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now, and why?
God knows. I'd like to be running a company again. It's what I'm good at. But actually, probably as strongly as that, I want to get a movement going. I want this question of ethics and corporate ethics, and it maybe extends more broadly than just data, but data is something which is particularly close to my heart. But this idea of having ethical management within corporations, which is transparent to users, and they might be consumers, or they might be other business partners in the supply chain. This ethical reassurance, I think, is something that we desperately need. I think that there is a clamour for it, there is a need for it, and there isn't yet enough people dealing with the practicality of it. And so that's where I'd like to invest a large amount of my effort over the next 5 years, is to move that conversation on, and to see if we can't start to put in place some structures and maybe an organisation that can help serve us.
Right, and I feel like you've already answered this, but I'll ask it again. How can we prevent another Cambridge Analytica scandal from happening? I mean, you've talked a lot about ethics and regulations, but any additional thoughts on that? Well,
I mean, negatively, I would say we can't. More positively, I think there are things that we as an industry can do in order to protect against it. But what I would say is, be under no illusion, what Cambridge Analytica was doing is carrying on exactly today, and it's within different organisations, but nothing, absolutely nothing has changed. And in fact, more than that, we've had another 4 years of innovation been applied to it. So, for example, the Trump campaign, they've been up and running and collecting data and analysing it and building profiles to target people almost non-stop, but certainly for the last 18 months to build their war chest of data, as it were. And the Democrats have spotted what happened and realised that they got caught short and have been investing and are investing heavily in order to upgrade their systems and their data. And in a sense, elections are a competitive environment, and so in one way, what's going on is exactly what should be going on. But there's not a lot of transparency, and that creates a vacuum to give rise to concern and fear.
Right, okay. Great, well, we have about 10 minutes left, so I think that we wanted to take some time for questions from the audience, right, Cameron? Okay. Oh, okay. Or
thank you for joining us today. I've got kind of a two-part question. The first part relates to access and use of outside data, not just what you scraped from or got from Facebook, but voter records that are maybe public in some jurisdictions, business records, and there are data aggregators. So to what degree does that fit into a profile? And the second part of that is there are inferences that are made. We might own some data, but I don't think we can own the inferences, and I'm scared of that.
Yeah, that's two really good questions, actually. So the first part is what Cambridge Analytica was doing, and what campaigns are doing now is huge amounts of outside data. The voter files are public and available for use by campaigns, and in fact, both of the parties have been collecting data on people and on voting patterns for decades. What's changed is the way it can be analysed. There's Cambridge Analytica acquired data from various data aggregators. It also conducted a vast quantity of surveys of people, which is actually more useful than the Facebook data ever was, I'll tell you. Surveys of people, not just to understand what their preferences were, but to understand what their drivers of preferences were, what psychological drivers were, in order to then make inferences. That data then gets modelled, and it becomes predictive. So I can maybe survey 500,000 people, and by comparing that survey results to people's data footprint, I can then analyse other people's data footprint in order to predict what I think that their drivers of preferences will be. And that's all in the pot. What it ultimately ends up with is something which, when it comes to running an advertising campaign, is statistically significant in that it's more efficient, but it's not an accurate predictor of someone's personality.
My question is then, what do you think of self-sovereign identity, decentralized ID, and how it might use blockchain? Does that solve any of these concerns that consumers might have, or do you think that because of the analytics that are applied and being able to still rely on a lot of past data, that it really, there's no way of being saved in that respect?
I think somewhere between somewhere in the middle, I would say. Here's one thing that we need to be careful about. When we talk about personal data or people's data or our data, there's lots of different types of our data. So, for example, my banking data, my bank accounts and such like, which is acceptable through login and would be accessible through a centralized ID. That's not the data that marketers are going for in order to influence. What they're going for is data around more demographic data, more easily visible data, and it's collected in a whole variety of ways, whether that's from land registry records to my activities on the internet. And also, I'm less nervous about that. I mean, the fact that someone might know I like fast cars is fine with me. Knowing the balance in my bank account is different. And so I think that there's a huge value in those types of centralized ID systems that will come, but it's not protecting the data that marketers in particular are. Actually, let me caveat that. They'd love to know what was in my bank account. But it's not what they're really going for.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for coming out. I'm wondering what a day-to-day life is like for you and Alexander these days.
That is a good question. Well, Alexander, I think, is largely keeping his head down. He went through a rough period. I mean, he made a mistake, went through a rough period, and time will be the healer of that. For me, I'm doing a lot more public speaking than I was ever doing before, and looking for the next big thing to consume me.
Hi there. You make an argument, it sounds like, for ethical compliance and audit in the private sector. I think a lot of people think of law or legal compliance as the low hurdle and ethics as the higher, more optional hurdle. And I see a prisoner's dilemma paradigm playing out where it becomes optional to do the ethical compliance to the detriment of a company's ability to compete. What sort of, and I think that's different from like SOC 2 and SOC 3 compliance where there's a risk management aspect and there's a competitive dimension of differentiation there. What sort of incentive do you see for companies to comply ethically in light of those premises?
So your question is interesting to me because your question almost presupposes that there isn't any room for competition on ethics. And actually I challenge that. And I think that the transparency is essential. The confidence that what's going on inside an organization is what the organization is saying is an essential part of that. But at that level then, there is a huge amount of space for companies to compete on their ethical robustness.
Thank you.
So it seems to me that ethics is sort of a relative term, and it's hard to really count on that as a true control in any way, shape, or form, because one management team may have one set of ethics and another may have another. And it also seems like analytics come down to be the bad guy in this analysis, but quite frankly, I think the problem is the money. And listening to Brittany's book, the vast amounts of sums that were spent, the ungodly amounts that were spent on advertisement, $55 million to impact 1 million views is just an unreasonable amount of just bombardment of people. It seems to me that there needs to be some sort of control, just like the nuclear arms race. Like we know where people know where to throw the bombs, but there's some controls on the size of the bombs and the number of the bombs. I really feel that was a big cause.
I mean, as a Brit, I hesitate to criticize the American electoral system, but I will point out it's different to the one that we have in the UK, where there are very tight constraints on what can be spent by political parties for campaigning. Here, you've always had a system, well, in fact, it got made worse with some changes, with some Supreme Court rulings around what super PACs could or couldn't do. But you've always had a system where money was a driver of spending on advertising, and it's, I guess it's for the people to choose as to whether or not you want that to continue. But I wouldn't disagree with your point.
Is there any other questions? Raise your hand high.
Hi. Is there anything that you wish you could take back from your time at Cambridge Analytica?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Is there anything that you wish you could take back from your time at Cambridge Analytica?
Oh, yeah, quite a lot. You know, Cambridge Analytica was a great company. It was a great company with really great people that had built a great capability. And it was hugely sad for me to have to close it down. The biggest mistake that Cambridge Analytica made was overhyping its capability in the press to an extent which was A, not real, and B, scary. And you know that's the thing that really brought the company down, and I wish I could go back in time and change that.
So you talk a little bit about you talk about a lot with transparency and what companies can do with our data and all of that. What can users do to know more about what companies are doing with our data? Is us reading all the disclaimers before we hit accept the only way, or are there other ways we can go about that?
Do you know, I think it's really hard. It's really hard because companies don't talk about what they do with data. They consider it to be their secret source. And there's no pressure today for companies to be more transparent about it. And so what users can do is join with me and call for that transparency and reward organizations that are transparent by using their services ahead of companies that are not transparent. You touch on another really good point, though, which is that all of us, most of us, click the terms and conditions on any website without actually reading them all. And so the transparency that I'm talking about, you could question whether or not that's going to be effective because nobody will take the time to read them all. And actually, I would look for concerned actors, lobby groups, journalists, etc. If those companies are transparent, then I think that the light will shine on those that have questionable ethical practices. But as far as what we can do today, it's very hard as an individual, other than to put pressure on companies to be more transparent.
Thanks.
Hi, Julian. Thank you for coming. My question kind of stems off of the user base as well. It looks like the current state of the market right now is a lot of these companies are kind of scraping data and selling it to people and making a lot of money off of that. Do you think that there are any implications with blockchain that might give the power to the user where they can actually earn money off of their own data?
Yeah, I really do. And I think that there's a space now for business model innovation, and I don't think we've got there. But if you look at the Googles and you look at the Facebooks, they're not just making profits off the data that they're using, they're making super profits. And all power to them, but I think it's about time that some of that was shared back with the users, and I think that there is space there for technology and business model, very probably using blockchain to address that.
Thank you.
And we have one more question. Hi. Reflecting upon your time at Cambridge Analytica, do you think that the services that they provided still are necessary in today's world? Do you think that what Cambridge Analytica did is something that companies should continue doing?
I'm going to say that I don't see why not. What Cambridge Analytica was doing at its core was not hacking into people's minds and getting them to do stuff against their will. What it was doing is it was making advertising more efficient. If you can reduce the wastage on ads, and if you can communicate with people more effectively on subjects that they want to be communicated on, and in language that they can relate to, then that advertising efficiency ultimately builds to overall economic efficiency and cheaper products and services. So I don't see why not. I just think that it needs to be done in a transparent and ethical way.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Julian. This is fun.